In May of 2011, when hospital workers walked into Beth Israel Medical Center room 31G in New York City, they found something that didn't make sense. The woman who had just died owned three apartments on Fifth Avenue worth over $50 million combined, but she'd lived in this single hospital room for 20 years. Her estate was worth $300 million, but her closest companion wasn't family or friends. It was her private nurse. She collected priceless dolls and owned a Stradivarius violin, yet almost nobody in America knew her name. Huguette Clark was the daughter of one of the most powerful men in American history, a copper baron and senator who built mansions and shaped the West. But when she died at 104 years old, the fortune that should have connected her to everything had instead isolated her from everyone. Before we dive into this story, if you enjoyed this hook, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more. Forgotten stories of America's wealthiest families. So, how does someone with that much money end up so alone? And what happened when everyone finally found out she was gone? Huguette Marcel Clark was born on June 9th, 1906, in Paris, France, which tells you something about the kind of wealth her family had. Her father, William Andrews Clark, didn't just travel to Paris for vacation. He maintained residences there because that's what copper barons who owned entire mountains in Montana did at the turn of the century. William Clark had built one of the largest fortunes in American history by the time Huguette was born. He controlled copper mines across Montana and Arizona, owned banks, railroads, and newspapers, and had recently finished a term as a United States Senator. The family fortune was estimated at over $300 million in today's money, and that was just what people could see. Huguette's mother, Anna, was William's second wife and nearly 40 years younger than him. She had been a ward in his household before they married, which raised eyebrows even in 1901. But when you have that kind of money, eyebrows don't stop you from doing anything. Huguette grew up in a world most people couldn't imagine. The Clarks owned a 121-room mansion on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan that took up an entire city block. It had art galleries, multiple ballrooms, and a swimming pool built to look like a Roman bath. They also owned a summer estate in Connecticut that was so large it required its own private train station. But here's what made Huguette different from the start. While her father was building empires and collecting political power, she was drawing. She loved art, music, and the small, delicate things that wealthy families often overlooked in their pursuit of more wealth. Her father noticed this. He commissioned portraits of her as a child and encouraged her passion for painting and music. He bought her a Stradivarius violin when she was still young, not because she needed it, but because she wanted to play. This wasn't just indulgence. It was William Clark recognizing something in his daughter that he'd never quite had himself, which was the ability to appreciate beauty without needing to own or control it. By the time Huguette was a teenager, her father was in his 70s and increasingly focused on preserving his legacy. He'd survived scandals that would have destroyed lesser men. There was the bribery scandal during his first Senate campaign that forced him to resign, then the second campaign where he simply bought enough votes to win outright. But William Clark had always believed that money could solve any problem, smooth over any controversy, open any door. He was about to learn that wasn't entirely true. In 1925, when Huguette was 19, her older sister Andre died of meningitis at just 16 years old. The family was devastated. William Clark had survived business rivals, political enemies, and public scandals, but he couldn't protect his daughter from disease. He threw money at the problem afterward, funding medical research and building hospitals, but Andre was already gone. Huguette watched her father realize for the first time that there were limits to what wealth could do. That lesson would shape the rest of her life in ways nobody could have predicted. If you're enjoying this deep dive into Huguette's early life, hit that like button and share this video with someone who loves untold stories of American history. William Clark died in 1925 when Huguette was just 19 years old. He left her and her mother an enormous fortune, but he also left them something else. He left them alone. Huguette's half-siblings from her father's first marriage contested the will immediately, claiming that Anna and Huguette had influenced the aging senator to cut them out of their rightful inheritance. The legal battle dragged on for years and exposed every detail of the Clark family's private life to public scrutiny. Newspapers published stories about the age gap between William and Anna, about the circumstances of their marriage, about whether Huguette was truly William's daughter. None of it was true, but truth didn't matter when you had that kind of money. Scandal sold papers, and the Clark estate was the biggest story in New York. Huguette watched this happen and drew a conclusion that would define the next 80 years of her life. Public attention wasn't worth the cost. In 1928, at 22 years old, Huguette married a man named William Gower, a law student from a respectable family who seemed appropriate by all the standards that mattered to wealthy New York society. The marriage lasted less than a year. Huguette filed for divorce in 1930, claiming that Gower was more interested in her money than in her. She never remarried. She never dated publicly again. She never explained what happened in that brief marriage, and nobody who knew her ever spoke about it in detail. But from that point forward, Huguette Clark began withdrawing from the world that her father had built his fortune in. She stopped attending social events. She declined invitations to galas and charity functions. She sold the massive Fifth Avenue mansion that her father had built and moved into a more modest apartment. Although modest by Clark family standards, still meant a sprawling residence overlooking Central Park. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, Huguette lived quietly with her mother Anna. They traveled together to their estate in Connecticut. They spent time in California at another family property in Santa Barbara. They collected art and music and surrounded themselves with beautiful things. But they didn't surround themselves with people. Huguette's mother died in 1963, and that's when the isolation became complete. Huguette was 57 years old, worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and almost entirely alone. She owned three apartments in the same building on Fifth Avenue. One was her primary residence, one was for storage, and one was kept empty just because she owned it. She filled these apartments with dolls, not children's toys, but expensive collector's dolls from France and Japan, some worth tens of thousands of dollars each. She had dollhouses built to exact specifications, with working electricity and hand-painted details. She hired craftsmen to create miniature furniture and commissioned artists to paint tiny portraits for the walls of rooms that were 6 inches tall. People who knew her during this period described her as kind, generous, and deeply eccentric. She would call her goddaughter at random hours just to chat about nothing in particular. She sent expensive gifts to friends and acquaintances for no reason except that she saw something and thought of them. She paid for the medical care of employees and their families without being asked, but she almost never saw any of these people in person. Everything was done through phone calls, letters, or intermediaries. She was disappearing into her own wealth, using money to maintain relationships at a safe distance while avoiding the actual human contact that might make her vulnerable again. And then, in 1988, something changed. Huguette checked into Beth Israel Medical Center for a routine procedure, and she simply never left. This is where the story gets truly strange. Huguette Clark was admitted to Beth Israel Medical Center in Manhattan in 1988 for what should have been a brief medical issue. The doctors treated her, she recovered, and then she refused to leave. She was 82 years old, in good health, and had three empty apartments waiting for her just a few miles away. But she told the hospital staff that she felt safer there. She felt comfortable. She wanted to stay. The hospital had never dealt with anything like this before. Patients don't usually ask to live in hospital rooms when they're not sick. But Huguette Clark wasn't a usual patient. She offered to pay whatever it cost. She would cover the room, the staff time, any expense the hospital incurred. She just wanted to stay. So the hospital agreed. Room 31G became her home. For the next 20 years, Huguette lived in that single hospital room. She decorated it with her dolls. She had her paintings brought in and hung on the walls. She kept the curtains drawn so she couldn't see the city outside her window. She hired a team of private nurses to care for her around the clock, even though she wasn't sick. Her primary nurse, Hadassah Perry, became her closest companion and confidant. Huguette called her at all hours, sometimes just to talk, sometimes to ask for small favors or adjustments to the room. She gave Perry expensive gifts, wrote her checks for tens of thousands of dollars, and eventually left her millions in her will. Meanwhile, her apartments sat empty. The power stayed on, the heat ran in winter, maintenance staff came through to make sure everything was in order, but nobody lived there. Huguette was paying hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to maintain properties she refused to set foot in. Her goddaughter, Wanda Steika, tried to visit her in the hospital, but Huguette often refused to see her. When Wanda did get through, Huguette would sit behind a curtain or ask that the lights be dimmed so low that Wanda couldn't see her face. Huguette told people she didn't want them to see her looking old. She didn't want to be remembered as elderly and frail. She wanted to be remembered as she was in her youth, which was beautiful and vibrant and surrounded by beautiful things. But the irony was that by hiding away, she was ensuring that almost nobody would remember her at all. The staff at Beth Israel knew her as the kind, eccentric woman in room 31G who collected dolls and tipped generously. But outside that hospital, Huguette Clark had become invisible. The press had forgotten about her. The social circles she'd once moved through had moved on. Even her own relatives had mostly lost touch with her. This went on for 2 decades, 20 years of living in a hospital room by choice, spending millions to maintain the illusion of a life she wasn't living, giving away her fortune to the few people who still had contact with her. And then, in May of 2011, Huguette Clark died at 104 years old. The hospital notified her attorney. The attorney began the process of settling her estate. And that's when America discovered that one of its wealthiest heiresses had been living in a hospital room for 20 years, almost completely alone, with a fortune that could have bought her anything except the one thing she seemed to want most, which was to be left entirely alone. The moment Huguette Clark's death became public, the lawsuit started. Her will left almost nothing to her family. Her father's descendants from his first marriage, people she'd never met or barely knew, were cut out entirely. Instead, the bulk of her $300 million estate went to the Bellows Guardo Foundation, a charitable organization she'd created to preserve her family's estate in Santa Barbara as a museum and art gallery. Hadassah Perry, her private nurse, was left over $30 million in cash and gifts. Her goddaughter Wanda received a generous bequest, but far less than the family members expected. Her attorney and accountant, Wallace Bach and Irving Kamsler, were named as executors of the estate and stood to earn millions in fees. Her distant relatives looked at this will and immediately cried foul. They argued that Huguette had been mentally incompetent when she signed the will. They claimed that Perry, Bach, and Kamsler had exerted undue influence over her, manipulating a lonely old woman into giving away her fortune to people who had taken advantage of her isolation. The lawsuit exposed details of Huguette's life that she'd spent decades trying to keep private. It revealed the hospital bills, the gifts to nurses that totaled millions of dollars, the empty apartments, the doll collections, the 20 years of self-imposed isolation. The media covered every detail. Suddenly, Huguette Clark was more famous in death than she'd ever been in life, which was exactly what she'd spent her entire adult life trying to avoid. The legal battle revealed something else, too. It showed how Huguette had used her wealth as a shield against the world. She'd paid people to maintain distance. She'd bought isolation with the same fortune her father had used to buy influence and power. William Clark had believed money could open any door, but his daughter had learned that it could also close them. She'd built walls out of cash and legal agreements in hospital rooms, and those walls had kept everyone out, even the people who might have genuinely cared about her. The lawsuit dragged on for years. Depositions were taken, bank records were examined, medical records were reviewed, and in 2013, the parties reached a settlement. The distant relatives received a portion of the estate. Hadassah Perry's bequest was reduced after questions were raised about some of the gifts Huguette had given her. The executors agreed to reduce their fees, and the Bellows Guardo Foundation received enough money to turn the Santa Barbara estate into the museum Huguette had always wanted. But here's what the settlement couldn't answer. It couldn't explain why someone with $300 million chose to live in a hospital room. It couldn't resolve whether Huguette had been taken advantage of or whether she'd made rational choices that simply looked strange to outsiders. It couldn't determine whether her isolation was a symptom of mental illness or a deliberate strategy to protect herself from a world that had hurt her. The money got divided up, the estate got settled, the lawsuits got resolved. But the mystery of Huguette Clark remained. So what do we make of Huguette? Clark? Was she a victim of manipulative caretakers who isolated her and drained her fortune? Or was she a woman who made deliberate choices about how she wanted to live, even if those choices looked incomprehensible to everyone else? The truth is probably somewhere in between. Huguette grew up watching her father use money as a tool to get what he wanted. She watched him buy Senate seats, silence critics, and smooth over scandals. She also watched him fail to protect her sister from disease and fail to shield her family from the public scrutiny that came after his death. She learned early that money could do a lot, but it couldn't do everything. And she seems to have concluded that the best use of extreme wealth was to build a barrier between herself and a world that had proven itself to be painful, invasive, and unpredictable. Her 20 years in that hospital room weren't about being sick. They were about feeling safe. The room was small, controlled, predictable. She knew who would come through the door. She knew what would happen each day. There were no surprises, no social obligations, no risk of being hurt or exposed or vulnerable. It was the ultimate expression of what her fortune could buy, which was complete control over her environment and complete isolation from anything that might threaten her peace. But that isolation came at a cost. She missed out on relationships, experiences, connections with the world that money can't replicate. She died surrounded by people who were paid to be there, which isn't the same as being surrounded by people who chose to be there. Her father had believed that wealth was about power and influence. Huguette believed it was about protection. And in the end, both of them discovered that no amount of money could give them what they really needed, which was genuine human connection without conditions. The dollhouses she collected tell you everything you need to know about how she saw the world. They were perfect, controlled, miniature versions of life where everything was exactly where it should be, and nothing could go wrong. She could arrange the furniture, choose the occupants, determine what happened in each tiny room. They were worlds she could manage completely, unlike the real world that had taken her sister, exposed her family to scandal, ended her brief marriage, and left her alone despite having every material advantage imaginable. She retreated into those dollhouses the same way she retreated into that hospital room, looking for spaces small enough to control and safe enough to inhabit without risk. Her legacy is complicated. The Bellas Guardo estate in Santa Barbara is now open to the public as a museum, just as she wanted. Her art collection is preserved. Her father's name is remembered through her charitable foundation, but Huguette herself remains largely forgotten, which is perhaps what she wanted all along. She spent 80 years trying to disappear, and in many ways, she succeeded. The question isn't whether she was right or wrong to live the way she did. The question is what her life tells us about wealth, isolation, and the human need for connection. She had everything that money could buy, and almost nothing that money couldn't. And that gap between the two destroyed her, just as surely as it had driven her father to build an empire in the first place. The story of Huguette Clark is a reminder that wealth solves certain problems while creating others. It can buy privacy, but privacy can become isolation. It can buy security, but security can become a prison. It can buy the ability to control your environment, but you can't control your way to happiness. Huguette's father believed that money was the answer to every question. His daughter learned that sometimes money is the question itself. If this story made you think about wealth, legacy, and what it means to live a meaningful life, make sure to like this video, share it with someone who appreciates these kinds of deep dives into forgotten history, and subscribe to the channel for more stories about the people and fortunes that shaped America. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.